Long Island, as you may know, has been the home or the site of hundreds, if not thousands, of shipwrecks going back to the colonial period. And if you look at this map, you can see why, because shipping coming up or down the coast, shipping coming from Europe, generally heading for New York City, either primarily from the ocean, but also down Long Island Sound, would have lots of obstacles to run into. On the North Shore, you can see all those headlands, which were left by the glaciers with reefs, rock reefs going out into the middle of the Sound. And on the South Shore, in the age of sail, you had no lighthouses, you had no other construction. You had sand dunes, and then you have big sandbars, sometimes a mile offshore. So at night or in bad weather, a ship that was not exactly sure where they were could easily run up on those sandbars and be wrecked, and without having any advance warning. So there's so many shipwrecks out there that a dive captain friend of mine nicknamed the area off of the New York Harbor as Wreck Valley, which is pretty appropriate name. And here's just a typical one, from 1908 up on the South Shore. But this was common right up through into the 20th century with modern navigation and better training and equipment, finally sort of putting a stop to most of these shipwrecks. But this gives you an idea of what it was like in the early colonial days. And in fact, the first known shipwreck off of Long Island occurs with a vessel coming in 1657 called the Prins Maurits. It was a Dutch brig carrying colonists from Amsterdam to what would become Delaware. So it gives you an idea of how early this was. So the ship had a 16-man crew, and they're bringing 113 colonists as part of a convoy to create the colony of Delaware. They left on Christmas Day in 1656, and they have a long passage and through a lot of stormy weather. And finally, they sight land on March 6th, but they don't know what they're looking at because none of them have ever been to the New World before or to New Amsterdam. So the captain is being cautious because they're coming in at 11 o'clock at night, and they have a crew up on the bow using a lead line, which is a way of determining the water depth. But before they could see the water getting shallow, the bow runs up on the sandbar offshore, a quarter mile from the beach. Nobody was injured or died in the wreck, and the captain keeps them on board until the next morning when they can see what's going on, and they realize where they are. And they had run aground on Fire Island near today's Saltaire. So they managed to get everybody ashore in a leaky rowboat, but then they're kind of stuck because they don't know where they are. There's nobody around. There's no firewood to even make fires. They managed to take sails and spars from the wrecked ship ashore to make tents, but they're basically waiting for somebody to find them. And then finally, after 6 days, 2 Native Americans came down the beach, saw what they were doing. They were able to somehow communicate, and the captain asked them to go to Manhattan and alert the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, to their plight. Well, the other ships had already made it into New York, so Stuyvesant knew something had happened to the Prince Maurice, but wasn't sure what or where it was. So when the Native Americans get to New York, the governor mounts a big rescue effort and sends several ships out with the Native Americans on board. They show them where Fire Island Inlet was because nobody from New Amsterdam knew about the inlet. So they were rescued, brought into the city. They're reunited with the other colonists on the other ships, and they make their way to what is now Newcastle, Delaware, to create that colony. So this is the first of many, many shipwrecks because the navigation is rudimentary, and there's really not much to help the captains navigate. So they continue through the colonial period into the American Revolution. I don't think I can point here. Maybe I can. So this is Montauk Point. Right here is Montauk Inlet into Montauk Harbor. And the area we're talking about here is Gardiner's Bay. During the Revolution, early on, the British won the Battle of Long Island in August of 1776, and then eventually took control of all of Long Island. But the Patriots had fled to Connecticut, and they were active on the Sound. So what the British did is send a succession of squadrons over, based out here in Gardiner's Bay, to try to blockade Long Island Sound. They would make raids down into the Sound to try to capture American shipping, and they would also patrol along the ocean coast. So in January of 1781, there's 3 British ships based out here in Gardner's Bay, and the captains looking at their barometers and see that the pressure is dropping, and they realize a big storm is coming. So the captains agree they're going to try to get out of Gardner's Bay, get out around Montauk Point out into the ocean, so they have what's called sea room to maneuver during the storm they know is coming. So the HMS Culloden is the second of the 3 ships in line as they're heading out in the dark, and then a snowstorm starts, and it becomes basically a blizzard. So the visibility is pretty much zero. So about midnight, HMS Bedford is the first ship in line, and the captain on the Bedford turns around and heads back out to sea again. The Culloden, Captain Balfour on the Culloden, which is the second boat, HMS Culloden, which is what they call a third-rate ship of the line with 74 cannon. For some reason, even though the first ship turns around and goes back the way they came, Captain Balfour on the Culloden continues on. He's concerned enough to put a couple of crew up on the bowsprit with lead lines to keep track of the depth. But all of a sudden at 4 a.m, the crew up on the bow yells back that they see breakers ahead. So the captain tries to reverse course, but their momentum carries them onto a sandbar a few hundred yards off the beach. There's 650 men on board, and none of them are really injured. So the captain waits for daylight, and they try to lighten the ship. So they take a lot of their provisions off. They take most of their cannons off onto the beach, but they still can't use their anchors to get the Culloden back into deep water. And this is an engraving of what the Culloden looked like. So basically, the captain, they dump their water supply. They take everything they can get off the ship, and they can't free it from the sandbar. So the captain orders the ship set afire to keep it out of the hands of the Patriots, and they burn it to the waterline. Another British ship comes back, picks up all the crew and the cannons and their provisions, and they sail away. The Americans show up that summer, and the British had dumped about a dozen or so, about up to 10 or 20 obsolete iron cannons over the side, and the Americans salvage the ones that they can reach and sail away and put them into the Continental Army. So the Culloden is out there. People in Montauk know about it. Occasionally over the years, some piece of wreckage will wash ashore and end up in somebody's mantle, but pretty much left alone. Back in the 1950s, the state of New York declares it protected by state law as a historic site, and it's pretty much ignored. People in Montauk know it's out there, but then scuba diving starts to become popular, and a group of divers decides to go out and help themselves to one of the Culloden cannon. So they pose for pictures, they bring the cannon ashore, and the word quickly gets out around the South Fork that these people have taken this cannon in violation of state law. So the authorities track them down, they take the cannon back, and then they deliver it to the East Hampton Maritime Museum in Amagansett, where you can still see it, along with other artifacts from the Culloden. So the town, East Hampton, puts up this monument on what becomes known as Culloden Point, just west of the Montauk Inlet. And the Long Island Divers Association sets up stairs. The town creates a town park. Divers can go out, dive out to the Culloden, which is in about 15 to 20 feet of water, 100 yards or so from the beach. Now, typically, depending on the winter storms, you can see some of the wreckage or nothing. So here you see divers using a propulsion vehicle to blow sand away from the tail end of a cannon. The one time I'm a wreck diver. The one time I went out there to look at the Culloden, all I could see was sand with iron stains, coming up from the bottom, but nothing else. But other times people have seen cannons sticking up, and occasionally even the edge of the hull down to where it was burned by the crew. This is a side scan done by the captain of a sea turtle based in Montauk. And if you look at the little bumps, each one of them is a cannon sort of sticking out of the sand. So this was on a good day. So shipwrecks continue after the Revolution. When the United States is formed, one of the first things that George Washington does as president in his first term is to authorize construction of the Montauk Point Lighthouse to try to make navigation a little easier. So this goes into effect in 1795. And early on from this picture, they don't have the brown and white stripes that you can see out there now. So ships coming from up or down the coast or coming from Europe have something to aim for. The problem was if they even found the Montauk Lighthouse, they'd still have to get their way down the coast for 110 miles to New York City with no other aids to navigation, nothing but sand dunes on the beach, and in bad weather at night, you couldn't see them. So the shipwrecks kept continuing. Then the government in 1826 built a first Fire Island lighthouse to try to help, which stopped some of the shipwrecks, but it's a short lighthouse. It's not built well. The lighting mechanism is primitive, and shipwrecks continue until 1858 when they build the current lighthouse at Fire Island. And the year before, because of the 60-mile gap between Fire Island and Montauk, they build this lighthouse in Shinnecock out in Hampton Bays to try to get people safely to the city. But even with these lighthouses, the shipwrecks continue. In the meantime, a lot of them happen down off of Fire Island because it's sort of halfway into the city, and there's a lot of room from Montauk to get into trouble on the way to the city. There's a couple of famous shipwrecks. I mean, they're happening constantly. One of the most famous is the steamship Savannah, which was famous before it ran aground and sank off of Fire Island in 1821, because it was launched 3 years earlier. And it had, besides its sails, it had the first steam engine installed on a commercial ship. So they made a voyage to Liverpool in 1819, powered in part by their steam engine, which is the first time any vessel had been sailed the Atlantic aided by steam power. By 1821, it had been sold. New owners decided the steam engine was too expensive to operate, so they removed it. And they were sailing from Savannah to New York carrying lumber. So in the final voyage in 1821, visibility was bad. There was bad weather. They're carrying 250 tons of cotton to New York. And the captain is navigating by what they call dead reckoning based on his previous position, and runs up on the sandbar at 3 o'clock in the morning after he hears breakers, but can't turn around in time. So he had two crewmen row him to the beach to try to get help. The boat overturns, he almost drowns, but he eventually gets back and brings the two passengers on board to shore, but the ship is a total loss. Nobody dies in that wreck, and Savannah, because it was famous for the 150th anniversary of the voyage, the U.S. Postal Service puts out this commemorative stamp. So a lot of wrecks on Fire Island and further west towards the city. This is the Bristol, one of the more deadly wrecks off of Long Island. It's transporting 127 Irish immigrants with a crew of 16 from Europe to America. This is during the famine period when a lot of people abandoning Ireland and Europe to come for a new life in New York. So the ship is pretty well in pretty good condition, and it has a good captain named Alexander McCown. And he arrives off New York Harbor on the night of November 20th, 1836. Now, typically, there's a big sandbar at the entrance to New York Harbor, so ships would not attempt to get into the harbor on their own. They would use the harbor pilot. And typically, the harbor pilots would be cruising in a schooner back and forth off the entrance to New York Harbor around the clock, so they'd be available whenever the ship arrived to get the ship across the sandbar into New York. But when the Bristol arrives, they can't find a pilot in the middle of the night. So the captain is alarmed. He starts putting lanterns up in the rigging, starts ringing the ship's bell, and even fires the ship's cannon trying to attract a pilot boat. But what he doesn't know is that there's a huge amount of ice is built up in the Narrows, and the pilot boats can't get out of the city, so they're on their own. So the captain decides to sail back and forth between Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and Long Island overnight, hoping with daylight he'll be able to find the pilot boat. And the crew either misunderstands his instructions, or they get lazy because it's a very cold night in November. So they make each tack longer, and eventually one of the tacks is so long they run up on the beach off the Rockaways. So at 3:45 a.m., a crewman yells a warning, but it's too late, so they're hard aground. The captain and the crew try to get the ship free, but the waves start to pick up and start to turn the ship broadside and start to break over the ship. The big waves, they rip off the deck hatches, and the ship starts to flood, and the passengers who are hiding below deck start to have to come up. Some of them actually get drowned in the hold before they can get out of the water. So things could have been worse, except the distress signals that the crew is sending off are seen by two Rockaway Beach fishermen. They run to the home of a local landowner named Stephen Ryder. He sends out his servants to get residents and fishermen from the small hamlet of Rockaway to go to the beach to see what they could do. And one of the servants goes to track down David Jennings, who's a state-appointed wreck master, which means they're in charge of trying to rescue people from shipwrecks and then preserve the cargo if possible. So Jennings gets three men to help him, and they launch a surf boat out to the Bristol, but the masts are about to fall down, so they can't get close to the ship. The captain, McCowan, cuts down the mizzenmast to use that like a platform for the passengers to work their way out to the lifeboat. So there are several attempts of bringing people in. Several trips are done to get people off the ship, but eventually it becomes too rough and they can't get back out anymore. So eventually the ship breaks up, and when everybody's accounted for, 100 people from the 143 on board have died in the accident. So at this point, this is the worst maritime disaster in American history. And there's a parallel accident not too long after the shipwreck of the Mexico, not far from the site of the Bristol sinking. This is another parallel, another immigrant vessel carrying 111 passengers, 12 crew, runs aground off of Long Beach on January 2nd, 1837. Now, McCowan was a captain. He made sure all the passengers that could be saved were saved before he worried about himself and his crew. And he did survive and was hailed as a hero. And the Bristol was in very good condition. The Mexico was an older boat, not well maintained, and the captain, Charles Winslow, was not as heroic as Captain McCowan on the Bristol. So, but they have the same problem when they get to New York in January. The ice floes are still blocking entrance to the harbor. They come after a 69-day voyage from England. The ship is leaking badly. They've run out of crew. Many of the crew members have frostbite or are otherwise incapacitated. So to try to get the ship into the harbor, the captain actually recruits 3 of the passengers as volunteers, which ends up saving their lives. So they end up sailing back and forth, firing distress rockets and their cannon and putting lanterns in the rigging, looking for the pilot boat. They can't reach them. And do the same thing as the Bristol did. They start sailing back and forth to wait for daylight to see if they can figure out what's going on. But they're so short-handed that the captain makes each tack longer and longer because he doesn't have the crew to turn the ship around. And eventually they run up on a sandbar just like the Bristol. At that point, the ship is in bad condition to start with. It starts to break up. And while McCowan on the Bristol was concerned mostly about his passengers, McCowan, the captain of the Mexico, was more concerned about him and his crew. So they hid in the cookhouse, and they left the crew, the passengers on deck, exposed to the weather. And then finally, when rescue boats came out to start pulling people in, Captain Winslow gets his crew up on the bowsprit, and they all get into the rescue boats before the passengers do. So this turns out to be a major disaster when the ship breaks up. A local fisherman named Rainer Rock Smith gets out and makes several attempts out to the ship and rescues some of mostly the crew initially, and then a few of the passengers. But then Smith makes one last trip with 8 survivors, and then decides it's too rough to go back. And the ship breaks up and sinks, and 108 passengers dies and 7 crew members, which makes the Mexico even more deadly than the Bristol, and is now the worst maritime disaster in American history. So only 8 people survive, including the 3 passengers who were helping to sail the ship, because they were able to escape with the rest of the crew. Winslow gets to the beach, warms himself by a fire, doesn't even look back at his ship as it breaks up and sinks. He's widely condemned in the media of the time. He's actually charged with manslaughter, but not convicted, and goes back to sea. Eventually, this is a painting of the Bristol on after the storm abates. You can see this is there's a lot of coverage of the 2 accidents because of the death toll. And the New York Sun, which is the biggest paper in the city at that point, does these special editions that sell out. So eventually, the people who die in the Mexico are buried on the beach. The people who die on the Bristol are carried to a cemetery on the border of Rockville Center and Lynbrook and buried there. They take the money out of the pockets of the people who died on the Bristol, and then local people chip in some money, and they build. They erect this monument for the people that died in both shipwrecks, which is still out there. Okay, next wreck, which turns out to be the worst maritime disaster in the history of Long Island, and we're talking Nassau and Suffolk because New York City is sort of a separate animal, and that's the steamboat Lexington, which Sal nicely plugged as my new book, which will actually be officially published on May 1st, but I'm starting to do lectures on it on Saturday. So the Lexington is a unique steamboat in several regards. It's designed and operated by Cornelius Vanderbilt, the so-called Commodore, who becomes a major force in steamboating in the New York region before he goes to dominate the railroads. So he designed the Lexington based on a pattern for bridges rather than steamboats. So it was built kind of a lattice work framework, which made it very strong, very light. He puts one giant steam engine in instead of the 2 typical steam engines, makes the paddle wheels 50% bigger. The Lexington is by far the fastest steamboat on Long Island Sound, and the most economical to operate because of the design. Vanderbilt runs it for 3 years and then sells it to forces his competitor, who's engaged in a fair war with, to buy it so he can put that money towards a newer, fancier, and even a faster steamboat. So it's owned in 1840 for a year now by the New Jersey Steam Navigation Company, which is the major shipping steamboat company on Long Island Sound. When it leaves for a trip to Stonington, Connecticut, they have a full-time pilot who's in charge of steering the boat with helmsmen steering. When there's ice, it's 4 degrees when they leave. They're going through ice on the East River. There's ice sheets out on the Sound. Around 6 o'clock off of Great Neck, they serve dinner. And around 7:30, the pilot, Stephen Manchester, is up in the pilot house that you can see right here. One of the crew runs in and says the ship is on fire. So Manchester leaves the pilot house, goes back towards the smokestack, and sees flames coming up around the smokestack. So the the Lexington is made of wood. It's got a lot of paint and varnish. It's basically a fire trap like any steamboat of that era would be. They have a steam fire pump up on the bow, and the crew starts to get that, try to get that in operation. They also have fire buckets to throw water on the fire. Manchester realizes the ship is probably doomed and tries to turn to the starboard to the right because they're off Eaton's Neck, which is the closest land. But the captain, George Child, runs into the pilot house, and Manchester and the helmsman try to spin the wheel to turn the Lexington towards the south, towards the beach. But there's iron rods running down the promenade deck, but those iron rods are connected to the steering wheel up in the pilot house and the rudder in the stern by rawhide ropes. And the fire spreads so quickly because the Lexington is moving at 13 miles an hour, and that wind is fanning the flames, that the fire spreads under the pilot house and burns through the rope. So they can't change the course. So they're still heading towards Stonington northeast. The fire around the engine has forced the engineering crew out of the hull, out of the engine room, so they can't release the steam pressure. So the Lexington is heading at full cruising speed towards Stonington and not towards the beach. And it takes about 20 minutes for the steam to dissipate on its own. In the meantime, the fire has engulfed the fire hose from the steam engine, so they can't use that. They get some of the fire buckets to throw water on the fire, but most of the buckets are located near the engine and are caught up in the fire. There are 3 lifeboats, which the crew and with help from the passengers tried to launch. But if you know anything about boating, if you try to put a small boat in the water while you're going 13 miles an hour, it's pretty much guaranteed not to work. So the 3 boats are swamped. The one up at the bow is actually crushed by the paddle wheel, and the other 2 are swamped and sink. And then finally, the people are jumping overboard. This era, not a lot of people can swim. By this point, the temperature is below 0, and the water is probably close to freezing. So a lot of people are jumping overboard and immediately dying of hypothermia or drowning. And eventually, only 4 of the roughly 150 people on board survive, thanks to the cotton bales, which there's 150 cotton bales on the main deck as the main cargo, and 3 of the 4 people who survive use them as rafts. The other reason anybody survives at all is to get a shot at outlasting the cold and the cold water. Is the pilot Manchester goes up on the bow where there's about 30 people gathered, and he tells them to stay put until the ship. Not only till the ship stops moving, but also until he thinks the ship is about to sink. So the fire breaks out around 7 o'clock, and people are abandoning ship around 8 o'clock. Manchester keeps the people with him up on the bow until about midnight, which is when he thinks the ship is about to sink. Among the passengers are 4 ship captains, from ocean-going ship vessels. One of them is a 24-year-old Connecticut resident named Chester Hillard. He watches the lifeboats attempt to launch the lifeboats and realize that's pointless. So there's about 15 to 20 people gathered around him in midships near the paddle wheel, and he persuades them to wait until the forward motion ends and then tells them to grab cotton bales and throw them overboard. He ends up on one with one of the passengers. Here's one of the illustrations of the ship on fire. Here's Hilliard and ends up on a cotton bale with one of the passengers who, because there's 2 of them on the cotton bale, their feet in the water, which means, they're basically freezing. So he goes over about 8 o'clock. The passenger with him basically gets hypothermic and just falls over and drowns. Manchester waits 4 more hours after Hilliard goes over at 8. He gets on another cotton bale. Here you can see him. And he's sharing the cotton bale with a fireman named McKenna, who dies from hypothermia and falls over. So Manchester survives. Hilliard survives. A fireman named Charles Smith survives because he gets on a section of the paddle wheel guard, which is wood. So they're out all night. A Captain Meeker of a vessel called the Merchant from Southport, Connecticut, sees the fire, and the fire is visible from both sides of the Sound. but only some people try to get out from their harbors, but they can't because of the ice. And Captain Meeker on the Merchant can't get out that night. But in the next morning, when the tide is high, he puts a lot of his cargo on the dock and manages to get out and look for survivors. So around 11 o'clock in the morning, between 11 and 2 in the afternoon, he rescues the pilot, Manchester. He rescues Smith, the engineer, and Hillard, the ship captain passenger. There's a fourth survivor, which is David Crowley, who's the second mate, and he goes over on a cotton bale, but he's, for whatever reason, on his time or the current, he drifts further east than the other three. He sees the Merchant out there picking up people. He tries to signal them, but can't get their attention. So he, when Captain Meeker heads back to Southport with his survivors, and he also picks up some of the bodies, he doesn't see David Crowley. So David Crowley continues drifting east. He drifts east on his cotton bale for 48 hours after he goes overboard. So he washes up on the beach in Riverhead, where he has to climb over this huge piles of ice that are built up, crawls 3/4 of a mile to a house where he sees a light, knocks on the door. The couple that lives there opens the door. He passes out, and they bring him in and treat his frostbite on his hands and feet. He's so severely injured by his ordeal that he stays with them for 9 months before he can go home to Providence. So a week later, the coroner in New York has an inquest, and they hear 8 days of testimony from the survivors, steamboat inspectors from Vanderbilt, other steamboat company people. The testimony basically proves that the Lexington was a good vessel. It was well equipped, well maintained. It had been converted to burn coal, but they had taken the proper precautions to do that safely. But the 12 jurors, all men, none of them have maritime experience. And the disaster has gotten so much coverage. It's like the Titanic of its day. The newspapers are screaming, to indict the shipping company owners and the crew that survived. So there's like this hysteria that somebody has to pay. There's all these sermons in churches where they say, people need to be charged with manslaughter or murder. So despite all the testimony basically exonerating the crew, saying the ship was well maintained, well handled, the jury excoriates the Lexington and the company's owners. They say it's unsafe to burn coal. It's unsafe to have cotton on board. And this is what people remember forevermore. And that's what I thought until I wrote the book. And when I actually read the transcript, I realized that this was sort of a kangaroo court. But they make recommendations for improved safety regulations, but it takes Congress a dozen years to finally get around to update the Steamboat Safety Act after there were multiple other steamboat explosions and fires. This is a portrait of David Crowley done because the three survivors all go back to sea. Crowley becomes his own captain, becomes relatively wealthy, commissions this portrait. And if you look here, you can see down here, this is the burning Lexington. And over here, this is him on his cotton bale. So it's a pretty amazing portrait. Interesting postscript is daily newspapers at the time could not use any kind of immediate illustrations. They could put like a basic wood block on the paper, but if they wanted something, an illustration tied to a news event, the technology to do lithographs took about a week to put an image together and print it. So you'd have images a week afterwards in Harper's Weekly and other illustrated weekly newspapers, but not daily papers. So the owners of the Sun contacted a young lithographer who was just setting up shop in Lower Manhattan named Nathaniel Currier, and they said, how quickly could you put together an image that we can put in extra special editions? Currier puts his team together. They work around the clock for about 5 or 6 days. And then the Sun prints these extra editions. They sell about 11,000 of them for several weeks, and they keep updating the image to make it better. And on the bottom, they keep updating the text, first with the reports about the wreck, and then they start to use the transcripts from the coroner's inquest. So this is what it would look like. And eventually, a lot of them are actually, the illustrations were hand colored. like this. And then when the New York Sun was done, Currier decides to make his own color versions, which sell widely all over the country and make him famous. Later, he partners with Mr. Ives, and Currier and Ives becomes the biggest purveyor of lithographs right up into the early 20th century. So the Lexington, there was three attempts to salvage the Lexington, or at least the valuables on board, in 1842, a month after the sinking, again the next year, and then again in 1850. And then it's pretty much ignored until 1983, when Clive Cussler, the adventure author who likes to find famous shipwrecks in his spare time, puts together in 1982 an expedition. They go out and locate where the wreckage is. In 1842, when they actually tried to bring it to the surface, but one of the chains supporting the hull breaks, and it breaks the ship in two, and the pieces and the paddle wheels fall off, and everything drops back to 140 feet down on the bottom of the Sound off of Port Jefferson. So Cussler, they find the wreck with side scan sonar. The next year, they go out with divers. This is Robert Watts of Smithtown, who's the only diver on the team, who actually gets down to the Lexington and brings up this piece of charred wreckage, which is the wreckage is the wood is dated and shows that it was from 1835, proving that it was the Lexington. A friend of mine went out and did side scan sonar. The visibility out there is usually pretty terrible. We're planning a dive trip out there in October to try to get new video and stills, but the side scan is actually so far the best way to see it. And this is from 2020. So here's the bow section, and you can see that kind of lattice work, that it wasn't built, solid timbers like most steamboats or other vessels. Okay, jumping to the South Shore. As I mentioned, the first fire and lighthouse was built 1826. It was not built well. The lighting mechanism was not very effective, so shipwrecks continued to happen even in good weather. And then finally, in the summer of 1850, there was a shipwreck that the government could no longer ignore the demand for better and more lighthouses. And it's because of the wreck of a ship called the Elizabeth that was sailing from Italy to New York. And it was kind of an ill-fated voyage. The captain dies while they're still in the Mediterranean. The first mate takes over, but he's not a very good navigator. And when they approach Long Island in bad weather, he thinks he's looking at the New Jersey shore instead of Long Island, and runs aground off of Fire Island. The reason the Elizabeth can't be ignored is this woman you see here in this daguerreotype. It's Margaret Fuller, who's one of the most famous women in America in 1850. She's a transcendentalist. She's a women's suffrage pioneer. And most visibly, she's a theater critic for the New York Tribune for Horace Greeley, the first woman critic of any daily newspaper in America. Here's a sketch of her and another image of her. So he ends up marrying an Italian count, and they have a son. And they visited Italy, and they're on the way back on the Elizabeth when the ship runs aground, and she can't swim. So some people, as the ship is breaking up, some of the crew and passengers try to swim ashore and drown. Because she can't swim, her husband stays with her and their young child. Some of the crew lashes her to the mast, hoping that rescuers will come out from the shore, but it's too rough for any of the lifesavers to get out to the Elizabeth. So eventually the ship breaks up, she drowns, and her husband and son die with her, along with most of the crew that stayed on board. The wreck and the loss of Margaret Fuller in particular creates an outcry. Horace Greeley starts to use the Tribune to write her obituary, but then also sort of mounting a campaign to get the government to build a new lighthouse at Fire Island and put new and better lighthouses around the country. So this is what the first one looked like, and then it was replaced by the one that's there now. This is before it has the black stripes on it. But eventually, in 1858, 8 years after the sinking of Elizabeth, they build the new lighthouse, and it goes into operation in 1859. So another ocean wreck, this one out off of Southampton. This is the Circassian, which is a boat traveling back and forth from Liverpool to New York on a regular basis, powered both by steam and sail. So on December 11th, 1876, they're off of Southampton and run aground on the sandbar about a mile offshore. They fired distress flares. One of the lifesavers named Samuel Howard sees the flares, sends off his own flares to show that he's seen the distress signal from the Circassian. The next day, the weather improves. The surfmen go out on multiple trips, 7 trips out to the wreck, and bring all 49 passengers and crew back safely. So it's an iron hull ship. It's in good shape. It's not even that hard aground. So the owners in New York send out rescue ships. They start taking the cargo off. They manage to turn the ship around to face out into the water, and they send out salvage tugs in an attempt to refloat the Circassian. They put the captain back on board with 16 of the former crew members, and they hire a dozen local workers from Southampton, including 10 Shinnecock Indians from the local reservation. And they're sent out there to remove the rest of the cargo to lighten the ship so they can salvage it. So they're out there doing this for a while, and then 18 days after the initial shipwreck, a storm starts to brew. There's still a line from the ship to the shore left by the life-saving crew. The crew begs the captain to let them use that line to shimmy back to shore because it's too rough for the lifeboat crew to come out. The captain reportedly says, "We'll float tonight or go to hell." He cuts that lifeline to the beach, so everybody's now trapped out on the vessel. Overnight, it gets rougher and rougher, and the Circassian starts to break up. The crew goes up in the rigging and lashes themselves, and the 10 Shinnecocks are singing hymns and praying. 4 men actually get to shore, clinging to a cork fender from one of the lifeboats, but that's about it. So in all, 28 die, including all 10 Shinnecock Indians. This is a Harper's Weekly illustration of what's going on the beach. It is Frank Leslie's Illustrated, showing people washing up after the wreck. This was a pretty big deal. This is the Brooklyn Eagles coverage of the wreck when it breaks up. And this is Captain Henry Hunting of the Life Saving Service, who was in charge of the initial rescue and then tries to save the people when it's breaking up, but can't get out there to help anybody. But the 10 Shinnecocks leave behind 9 widows and 27 children. And this is David Bunn, one of those lost. This is a relative, James Bunn, and Warren Cuffey, who is a Civil War veteran, also lost. Eventually, the tribe put up this monument listing the names of the 10 Shinnecock who died. A script to the Circassian is the crew, the rescue crew took one of the anchors out offshore to use that to help try to pull the vessel off the sandbar. In the mid-1900s, when a fisherman out of Shinnecock brings up one of the 2 anchors in his net, sells it to a fishing station in Shinnecock, who later sells it to another fishing station in Babylon. And when he decides to close his business, he donated, in February 2021, he donated the anchor to the town of Southampton, which was turning the old Tiana life-saving station into a maritime life-saving museum. So here you can see them bringing the anchor out from Babylon. Another wreck off of Fire Island. This is the Canard steamship Oregon, again, powered by steam and sails. This is a really kind of strange wreck. This is an iron-hulled ship, 518 feet long, pretty substantial. You would think if this ship hit a wooden fishing schooner, it wouldn't be much of a contest. But they're sailing about 4 in the morning in 1886. in March with clear weather, and they run into a fishing schooner, the Charles Moss from Maine. The schooner sinks immediately with everybody on board. There's never no trace of it is ever found again. But the Oregon was traveling fast enough that 3 large holes are knocked into the bow, and water starts pouring in. But the ship is big enough and the pumps are working, so they know they have to abandon ship, but it takes them a while for the ship to sink so long. It kept the Oregon afloat for 8 hours, so that not only they rescue everybody safely who wasn't injured in the original collision, but they had time to give them tea and toast before they got into the lifeboats. So the Oregon goes down 130 feet of water off a fire island. There's another image. It's an actual photograph of the Oregon. This is a Illustrated Weekly illustration of the ship going down in 1886. This is another competing newspaper illustration. This is an illustration of what it landed on the bottom. The bow sort of broke off and it tilted over on its side, and then the rest of the ship is upright. And this is the big boiler you can see here. It's considered, for wreck divers like me, it's the premier wreck off of Long Island because of the generally clear visibility, and there's a lot of artifacts that people have brought home, including this cup with the Canard logo that I found a couple of years ago on the first dive of the season. Another wreck off of Fire Island is the only large American warship lost in the First World War with the heavy armed cruiser, the San Diego. It was being used for convoy duty because of the presence of German U-boats. And in July of 1918, it had just come back from Europe, was heading to New York to pick up another convoy. They had reports of U-boat activity, so the crew was at battle stations. But all of a sudden, there's a large explosion on the port engine room because they hit a mine left by a U-boat that was already on its way back to Europe. So Captain Harlan Christie tells the helmsman to aim to head for the beach because he wants to run the ship aground so it can be salvaged. But the fire from the mine explosion sets an ammunition locker right behind the engine room on fire, and there's another explosion, and they lose power. So the captain orders abandon ship. Here's a painting done at the time showing the Oregon, the San Diego starting to go down. And here's a modern painting done by a diving friend of mine, much better image. So 6 people die, 2 in the original explosion. There's 1 crewman up here in the crow's nest, and when the ship capsizes and sinks, he's trapped in there for some reason. 2 others died when people are abandoning ship because they're throwing life rafts and life rings over the side when people are in the water. One of them gets hit in the head and drowns. But luckily, the 600 the crew, the rest of the crew survives. Some of them get to the beach in lifeboats. The Navy sends out, rescue fleet and picks up other lifeboats still out there. So it lands upside down, crushes everything down to the deck level. This is what it looked like maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Since then, a lot of the hull plates have fallen off, so it looks more like Swiss cheese now. But the ship sank in 28 minutes. The captain, in keeping with naval tradition, is the last one off the ship. The 1,200 crew, except for the 6 who died in the sinking, were all rescued. This is the second favorite wreck of wreck divers. It also was a dangerous wreck early on. 5 divers died in one season because people would go in one of these holes, and because the ship is lower at the bow and tilted to the left, people would go down, not realizing they had swum over or under a break in the deck, and then turn around to try to go back out and not realize they were on a different deck and the hole that they were looking for wasn't there. So 5 divers were trapped, ran out of air, and drowned in 1 year. I persuaded my editors at Newsday to let me go with a photographer to take a look and see what the deal was with this shipwreck. And they weren't initially excited about the idea, but we had 4 dive instructors take the 2 of us down and didn't go in the wreck. And that was my first experience of wreck diving around New York. So over time, the navigation equipment got better, the lighthouses got better, and you have less shipwrecks, but they still would occur. This is the propeller of the San Diego, which was later, the propellers were cut off and salvaged for scrap. Last serious wreck was in the middle of the 20th century out here in Huntington Bay. And that was the tug Gwendolyn Steers, which was owned by the Steers Sand and Gravel Company of Northport. And it would be used to bring gravel barges from gravel quarries in Northport into New York City, to build skyscraper foundations. So on December 30th of 1962, the Steers was bringing empty barges back to Northport, December 30th, 1962, when a nor'easter with hurricane force winds sweeps in. So they're off of Lloyd Neck. They're almost back into Huntington Bay, where they could have gotten safely into Northport. But they start taking on water. So they about 4:30 in the afternoon, they radio the Coast Guard, and they say they're taking on water, but the pumps are keeping up with it. So the Coast Guard commander at Eaton's Neck says, okay, let's talk every hour to make sure you're okay. An hour later, the Coast Guard tries to reach the Gwendolyn Steers on the radio, and there's no answer. Because of the storm, they can't go out and search till the next day, and there's no sign of the Gwendolyn Steers. But they do find, this is a modern painting of what it looked like in the storm, and you can see ice is built up heavily on around the vessel. They can't find any trace of the Gwendolyn Steers, but they find a lifeboat washed up on shore nearby, filled with ice, and in the ice is the body of one of the crewmen, and the Coast Guard men had to chip him out, and this is a famous picture that ran in Life magazine afterwards. Eventually, they find the 7 other bodies from the crew wash up at various points along the Long Island shore. And then following in the spring, another tugboat from the same company is heading into Northport, and they see a heavy line floating in the water. So they think it might be attached to the Steers. So they put a float on it and alert the company and the Coast Guard, and divers go down and find the Steers on the bottom, perfectly intact, no holes in it, no indication of why it would have sunk. So nobody will ever know what happened. But the presumption is, if you go back to this illustration, is that so much ice built up on the upper decks that the ship became unstable, and basically in one of the big waves just rolled over, sank, and took everybody down with it. But that was the last major shipwreck, luckily, because hasn't been a major loss of life around Long Island since 1962. So we're hoping we can keep that record going. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will be back with a full lecture on the Lexington in the near future.